Welcome to Transformative Principal, where I help you stop putting out fires and start leading. I am your host, Jethro Jones. You can follow me on Twitter at Jethro Jones. One of the best pieces of feedback that I've gotten during the pandemic with the masterminds that I run is that principals are enjoying talking about instruction and not just talking about COVID rules and regulations. It's one of the great things that we get to do in the mastermind is focus on the things that really matter. And sometimes we try to focus on other things, on the distractions that take us away from our vision, but we're always able to come back because our whole goal is to help us get our schools to where they need to be. So I would love to have you in there. And if you've been listening to the podcast for a while, you've probably heard me talk about it before. You probably have questions. Just go to jethrojones.com/mastermind and let's set up a time to talk about it. That's jethrojones.com/mastermind and then click on schedule a call. I look forward to talking with you. Again, that's jethrojones.com/mastermind. Welcome to Transformative Principal. Today I'm excited to welcome to the program Dr. Chad Dumas. He's an educational consultant, international presenter, and award-winning researcher whose primary focus is collaborating to develop capacity for continuous improvement. And we are excited to talk today about his book, which is Putting the C in PLC, or Put the C in PLC is the name of the book if you want to look for that. And you can also find a link to buy that book at jethrojones.com/podcast. So Chad, welcome to Transformative Principal. Happy to have you.
Oh, thanks so very much for being here. I'm really a big fan and I appreciate the opportunity to share with your listeners some of my thoughts.
Well, good. I'm excited to talk with you also. It's always fun to have a good nerdy conversation. So I'm looking forward to that today. And, we're talking about PLCs and I've had guests on the podcast to talk about PLCs numerous times. And it's one of those things in education that I think might be at the point where it's almost lived its lifespan and is ready to either be retired or rethought of. I was a principal and a teacher in numerous schools, and lots of schools said they were PLCs and they acted totally differently than other schools. So let's just start by defining what clearly is a PLC and how do you know if you're in a PLC school?
Yeah, I think your point is really well taken that, I saw some research actually, I think it was back in November or December from Peter DeWitt, and he shared that the number one hated term in education is PLC. And I thought, wow, first of all, there's a lot of terms that you could hate. And education has some pretty stiff competition there. But second of all, wow, we must not be, quote unquote, doing PLCs the way they're intended to be done. Because we know from 50, 60 years of educational research that if we want to improve learning for kids and we want to create equitable outcomes for all students, then the best way to do that is by getting our teachers working together in a collaborative environment focused on improving their effectiveness and results for students. And so in like the simplest sense, that's a professional learning community where we're all together taking collective responsibility for student learning. We're using results to assess our practice to get better. And then we're working together to make it happen. I mean, that's like this ethos, if you will, or this culture of a PLC. And I hope that idea doesn't go away because we know it works. I hope the specific ideas of what PLCs are not that many times are happening in schools right now, I hope that can go away and that we can shift towards true cultures where we're doing those three things. We're focusing on learning first, we're using our results, and we're working together to get better at our practice.
Mm-hmm. So you say put the C back in PLC. What does that mean?
So as your listeners know, PLC is our acronym for Professional Learning Community. And the idea is community that, many times PLCs are a time and it's at 3 o'clock on Wednesdays, right? Or it's a group of people and the third grade team is a PLC. That's how we refer to it. And really what PLC is this community. It's a community of professionals who are working together to learn and improve our practice. That's a professional learning community. The idea is that, all kinds of folks have done a lot of work around PLCs over the literally 50, 60 years. Shirley Hord did the first work in the 70s around this. And then the DeFores kind of came along and put together specific processes. And Michael Fullen talks about how you lead change. And Todd Whitaker does a lot of work around leadership practices, and Stiggins about assessment. Like there's all these experts in all these different areas of what it takes to build a PLC. But nobody has come and said, look, building principle, or if you're a central office person, supporting building principle, or if you're a teacher leader who's aspiring to be a principal or in a teacher leadership role, what do you need to know to build a PLC, to create this collaborative community? And so I combed through the research of all those gurus that I mentioned earlier and identified 10 elements of principal knowledge. This is what you need to know to be able to build a collaborative environment for teachers. I originally did that work to build a dissertation, and that dissertation was a finalist for PDK's Outstanding Dissertation Award, and it received Learning Forward's Best Research. And then those ideas were put into practice in a mid-sized district in South Central Nebraska with high poverty, high diversity school district that over the course of 5, 6, 7 years went from being labeled as persistently lowest achieving to having 5 out of the 7 schools national models for improving student learning. And that's because of taking these ideas and putting them into practice. Like, how do we create this community of professionals who are learning together to improve our practice and results for kids?
Yeah, very good. My very first interview on this podcast, all the way back in 2013, many years ago, was with Sandra Jolovich Motes, who did something very similar in her school, took them from being the very bottom of the barrel in the whole state to being one of the top 10 schools in the state. And she was the first person that I met where I said, man, I really should find out what the secret is. And so sure enough, I went and asked her, and I bet many of the things in your book would be similar to what she did, but she actually had really great processes around building a collaborative environment and a community in her school so that we were actually focused on student learning and kids could benefit from the results of the teachers working together. So, we certainly don't have time to go through all 10 elements of that principal knowledge. However, first of all, I didn't know there were awards for amazing dissertations. I didn't even know that.
Yes, there are.
I thought people just, wrote them and put them on a shelf and they were like school improvement plans and that nobody ever looked at them again. But congratulations on getting being a finalist in that award. That's pretty cool.
Thank you.
One of the areas is having a collaborative culture. How is a collaborative culture different than just a great culture in your school? Because there is a difference between just a good culture and a collaborative culture.
So collaborative culture really, in the way I think of it with PLCs, this idea of this ethos or culture really is focused on doing those 3 big ideas as the DeFores talk about, right? We're focused on learning, we're using our results, and we're getting better. I think you can have a healthy, quote unquote, healthy culture in a school and not necessarily be working together to improve learning. Like we get together and we have great staff meetings, or we get together and, in teams and, every week somebody brings food and, we have a really good time and we have really well organized field trips and kids are well behaved in the hallway and all these types of things. Those may or may not actually improve student learning. And the key to, I think, a PLC culture is that we're focused on improving student learning and our practice as adults that goes along with it. So I think that would maybe be one of the key distinctions. There are probably some others, but that would be like one of the key ones in my mind is, are we actually focused on the learning of students and our role as adults in improving that practice?
Yeah, in the second school I was a teacher at, I believe we're doing really well with that we were focused, we were determined, and we met for the purpose of improving student learning. And it wasn't, because it was PLC time or anything like that. And really what you said a few minutes ago about PLC as a time in many schools, that's not what we were about at all. It was very focused on improving student learning. And we saw how students improved when we made that focus. And it wasn't always pretty, to be honest. And there were some adult fights sometimes and not, certainly didn't come to blows, but we had very strong opinions and we voiced those. And I was really grateful for having that productive conflict that we had
Yes.
In the school. So, I still feel like those teachers that I was on a team with were and still are some of my best friends and people that I would love to. We don't live close to each other now, but I would love to catch up with them. And I have on occasion done that. And it really does make a big difference. So let's talk a little bit about that conflict that can exist and how to set that up so that it's productive and not destructive.
I heard someone once say that if there's 3 of us in a room and we all agree, then 2 of us are unnecessary. And I think that's maybe what you're getting to, is this idea of we need to engage in cognitive conflict. We need to be sharing ideas with each other. The problem that we run into many times in schools and in life is that we shift out of cognitive conflict and get into affective conflict, and we become in conflict with each other personally. And that's no bueno, no good. We want to stay in cognitive conflict. And so there's some skills and strategies that are helpful to be able to stay in cognitive conflict for any principal that's working with staff, or with staff that are working with each other, or staff that are working with the principal, whatever, or spouses working with each other. There's 3 skills in particular that comes from the cognitive coaching world and the adaptive schools world. And those are pausing, paraphrasing, and posing questions. And I refer to it as a 3+1, because those are the 3, but in the +1 is in an environment of being in rapport with each other. And so when we are in rapport with each other, then we use those 3 skills, and it helps us to stay in cognitive conflict. If you don't mind, I'll just share briefly with you and your listeners a little bit about these 3+1. So rapport is a physical expression of being in relationship with someone. And you can notice this, as the pandemic winds down and we get out into restaurants more and more. You can notice when you go to a restaurant and look around the room, you'll notice people who are in rapport with each other and people who are not. And it's really easy to tell those who are not, because there'll be maybe a couple who are not in rapport, and you can just tell by looking at them that they're not, because they're not leaning into each other, they're not nodding heads along with each other, they're not, if one's making large arm gestures, the other one's making small gestures or whatever, right? I mean, this being in rapport with someone, there's a mirroring that happens, mirroring in terms of intonation of voice, in terms of body expression, head tilt, movement, like all these nonverbal things. And so that's important to get into rapport with someone. So if I know I'm going to be in cognitive conflict with someone, or if I am in cognitive conflict, I need to purposely work to mirror the body language of the other person, not mimic them, because that's going to just tick them off. But I want to mirror that so that we can stay in rapport. It's kind of reminds me of the idea that, no one in the history of the world has ever calmed down by being told to calm down, right? Because you're not in rapport. So if somebody's upset, what you have to do is match them, and then you can gradually work them down into a calm state by being in rapport. So that's the first idea. And then the 3 specific skills of pausing, paraphrasing, and probing for specificity, really powerful for being in cognitive conflict. Because, so for instance, on pausing, and I just paused for your listeners, right? It allows the brain to get some blood flow to it and to think, right? The prefrontal cortex is where all of our thought happens, and it's the furthest away from the heart. So it takes the longest time for the blood to get there and the oxygen and the flow, not like the amygdala right in the back that, is the fight or flight mechanism that is what responds when we're in affective conflict. So simply taking a breath, simply pausing, Simply breaking rapport and looking off into the distance and thinking for a second can do wonders for facilitating cognitive conflict. After a pause, then a paraphrase can be really helpful. So it sounds like one of the priorities for you in this case is blah, 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 blah. So you would like to see X, Y, and Z happen? So there's 3 things going on right now. 1, 2, 3. So if I pause and allow myself to process and allow them to think, and then I paraphrase for them, now I've opened up a communication channel whereby that person either knows that I understand or has an opportunity to clarify because I don't understand, right? And this enables that cognitive conflict to proceed and not get into effective conflict. And then finally, the use of probing questions. So probing for specificity or asking questions about, the situation. So can you tell me a little bit more about, so when you mentioned X, Y, and Z, tell me a little bit more about why that happened or how that happened, right? I mean, lots of questioning skills and strategies, but the use of the 3+1, as I refer to it, is very powerful and helpful in helping us be in cognitive conflict so that when we're with these teams, we can be effective. And like you said, my experience is the same as yours. People who I've engaged in cognitive conflict with productively, I have the best relationships with over time.
Yeah, that's definitely what I've seen as well. John Catt Educational supports high-quality teaching and learning by providing publications that are research-based, practical, and focused on the key topics proven essential in today's and tomorrow's schools. The latest John Catt publications include a book whose bold, transformative ideas amaze and infuriate people around the world, according to one reviewer, a title from global leaders in curriculum planning, practice, and retrieval, one book that says stop talking and start doing with regard to teacher well-being, and much more. These books, used by educators of all roles across North America and worldwide, amplify fresh, engaging voices with practical strategies to create transformative change. Learn more in our show notes at jethrojones.com/podcast. I think one thing I would add to the 3+1 is when you're pausing, then sometimes people could be caught off guard by that pause, and it forces other people to think as well. And so if somebody's railing on you and then you pause and don't react in the exact same way, then they can say, wait a minute, what just happened here? Why are they not? Okay, hold on. Let me try to figure out what's going on. And I've seen that happen as well, where somebody can be frustrated or feeling not so great about things, and then you pause and they take a second to pause and calm down as well. It doesn't always happen, but that's another thing that I've seen as well. So I'm working with a principal right now who's trying to get PLCs going in her school and is doing a lot of work around that. And she's stressing because it feels like everything is going to take so long and nobody's going to buy in until so much later. What are some things she can do to get some quick wins or early wins on introducing PLCs and creating these opportunities for teachers to really work together?
Our work doesn't just go down in flames when we leave. Because I remember somebody once said, none of us is getting out of here alive. So all of us are going to be leaving at some point. So we all have to be thinking long term at some point when we're gone, is our work going to sustain itself? So one of the things I think about, whether it's PLCs or curriculum implementation or instructional practices or MTSS, like choose your buzzword or choose your initiative that's going on, is in order for that to be effective, there really needs to be a leadership team. Some people might call them a guiding coalition. And it depends on the school, right? Some people call it a school improvement team. Some people call it an advisory, whatever you call it, it doesn't matter. What matters is there's a group of folks who they're the ones who are taking the responsibility for making sure that whatever that initiative is, initiative X, is gonna work. And there's some really important research that's been around for a little while on implementation science that says that if you do not have that team to lead the work, then after 17 years, you may have as high as like 14, 15% implementation. Whereas if you do have a leadership team that understands the change, first of all, and then second of all, they understand change itself. Like they understand that how to lead change. And so you have to build their capacity in how to lead change, which means that we as leaders, like nobody taught me how to lead change. I had to go out and learn that myself, right? So if that leadership team understands change and the initiative, within 3 years, you'll have close to 90% implementation. Now, 3 years is still a while, but it's better than 17 years and only, best of 15%.
Considering most principals aren't even in buildings for 17 years, I mean, of the hundreds of people that I've interviewed, very few have been around specifically in a single school for that long.
Yeah, so I think the first thing is make sure you got a leadership team and build the capacity of that leadership team to understand the change that you're after, and then understand change theory, models, and processes. And then, so that's like a general, whether it's PLCs or anything else. In terms of PLCs itself, I think there's a couple of things that come to my mind. One is make sure that you're talking with your staff about how to organize them for the teaming. Too many times I've seen that teachers are quote unquote thrown together in groups because it makes sense to schedule. But it doesn't make sense to those teachers, and it doesn't make sense to the kids that they're teaching. And so make sure you're opening that conversation and having those conversations with the staff to be able to figure out those teaming structures. And then second of all, once you have those teaming structures in place, work to build the capacity of those teams to be effective during that time. And there's two things that come to my mind in terms of the effectiveness of those teams. And it comes from a study from Google from just a few years ago, where they studied a couple hundred teams. And they looked at what makes an effective team effective. And it's not the content knowledge of the members, right? They're not experts at that. It's not how much they like each other, as you mentioned earlier. It's not all these things that we sometimes think. It was two things. Two things make an effective team, according to this Google research. Number one, the ability of the members to read nonverbal cues from each other. Like, can I tell that Jethro's ticked off at me, and am I responding accordingly? Or am I just aloof to it? So like helping our staff read each other's emotional cues, number one, that's tough, but it can be done. And then number two, which is a little bit easier, equity of turn taking. Does everybody in the group have an opportunity to express their voice in meaningful ways? And so, in some groups, that's things like a timer, but more often than not, it's protocols. Like we have protocols in place. We have clear agendas. We have norms or working agreements, depending on what you call it. But these things are really important in terms of getting teams to be effective. So that, I guess that would be three pieces of advice for this principle is one, make sure you got a leadership team. Number two, make sure that you talk to the teachers whenever you're figuring out groupings. And number three, make sure that those groupings, that you're building the capacity of people to be effective when they're in those groups.
Yeah, that's all great advice. And, one thing I would just add to that is that as you're making sure the teams are effective during that time, that you have an idea of what effective means. Defining that, especially with your leadership team, seems like a given, but it's not always the case. And in different schools, I've had different experiences with what effective means during that time. And so in that school I was talking about earlier, effective means that we were reviewing our data from the student assessments, and we were adjusting our instruction based on that. And we were a cross-curricular team, so we were then also determining places where we could bring each other's curriculum into our classroom and push our content into other people's classrooms as well. So for us, that's what effectiveness looked like. And in other schools, it was just different. So being able to define that clearly, what it is we need to be doing during that time is really important. Just want to remind everybody, Dr. Chad Dumas, you can get his book and connect with him at nextlearningsolutions.com. And he is also on Twitter, and you could follow him at Chad Dumas, excuse me. So the last question I would like to ask you, Chad, is what is one thing that a principal can do this week to be a transformative principal like you?
So thinking forward to next year, right? Because we've got a summer coming up and then start of next year. And I always think about during my summer, how can I get myself to be most effective? And one of the things that I would highly recommend for most principals that I've worked with, and most teachers as well, and this is a very simple, common thing that might be helpful to your listeners. And that is to figure out a way, and I feel bad about saying this because it's not really very like, aha, mind-blowing or anything, but it's figure out a way to get your email under control. And there's some great tools out there. I would suggest, if you've not heard of Justin Bader and the 21-day leadership challenge, instructional leadership challenge, get on his website and take that leadership challenge over the course of this summer. It's like 5-minute videos over the course of 3 or 4 weeks. Watch those videos. You'll get some great tips about how to get your email under control. Because if your email is under control and other management aspects of your work are under control, you can spend more time and energy focusing on being that transformative leader in your school. So again, it's not like a mind-blowing idea, but I've seen more of us than not who don't have our email under control. And I think if we did, we could be much more transformational.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And I've talked a lot about email being the bane of our existence on here, and especially during the pandemic. I mean, as soon as schools closed in the spring of 2020, my email inbox just quadrupled in size just like that. And, everything has come from, having a casual conversation in the hall to doing things on email. And I haven't seen it slow up that much. People are still relying on that a lot. And so one piece of advice I would have about that is to use different tools like Basecamp, which is my personal favorite, or Trello or Asana or Monday. There are a ton of different things out there that are really good, and move some of that stuff out of email, because email can just suck you in and make you think you're getting stuff done when you're really not. So
this is true.
Yeah. Chad, that you may feel like that's not really, that deep or amazing, but let me just tell you that is a needed thing. And I appreciate you bringing that up. So
good.
Well, thank you. Once again, thank you for listening to Transformative Principal. This has been a great conversation with Chad Dumas, nextlearningsolutions.com, and on Twitter at Chad Dumas. Once again, thank you, Chad, for being part of Transformative Principal.
Thanks so very much. Really appreciate it. It's an honor.
Hey, middle school principals, what if I told you that all your teachers had to do to teach your students really valuable social and emotional competencies was just press play? In Control SEL is a fully automated video curriculum that teachers and students absolutely love. And that's because it's easy, and it looks just like a Netflix or a YouTube show. So all you have to do to hear about how it can completely transform your school is schedule your call. Tell us Jethro sent you and you'll get 20% off if you feel like it's a good fit. So go now to www.incontrolsel.com/strategy call to schedule your call today. The link will be in the show notes.